welcome to Heavy Storytelling. We are going to be reading a story, but first you're going to be reading the Bible, and then you're going to be doing stuff, and then you're going to be reading Miracle on 34th Street. Got it right. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss another video. Hair tie.
Hair tie?
Comment below. I don't know why I said that. Well, let's get straight into it. Hi, Mom. Here's my dad.
Hello! How are we doing, crazy heads? Alright, so we are in the middle of Psalm 119, and then we're going to pick up with chapter 7. And let's go ahead. This is the English Standard Version, and begin.
Where?
Starting with verse 57. I'm going to stop trying to say the Hebrew letters because I don't know how they're supposed to be pronounced. So I'm just going to keep reading. The Lord is my portion. I promise to keep your words. I entreat your favor with all my heart. Be gracious to me according to your promise. When I think on my ways, I turn my feet to your testimonies. I hasten and do not delay to keep your commandments. Though the cords of the wicked ensnare me, I do not forget your law. At midnight I rise to praise you because of your righteous rules. I am a companion of all who fear you, of those who keep your precepts. The earth, O Lord, is full of your steadfast love. Teach me your statutes. You have dealt well with your servant, O Lord, according to your word. Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I believe in your commandments. Before I was afflicted when I went astray, but now I keep your word. You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes. The insolent smear me with lies, but with my whole heart I keep your precepts. Their heart is unfeeling like fat, but I delight in your law. It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. The law of your mouth is better to me than thousands of gold and silver pieces. Your hands have made me and fashioned me. Give me understanding that I may learn your commandments. Those who fear you shall see me and rejoice, because I have hoped in your word. I know, O Lord, that your rules are righteous, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me. Let your steadfast love comfort me, according to your promise to your servant. Let your mercy come to me, that I may live, for your law is my delight. Let the insolent be put to shame, because they have wronged me with falsehood. As for me, I will meditate on your precepts. Let those who fear you turn to me, that they may know your testimonies. May my heart be blameless in your statutes, that I may not be put to shame. My soul longs for your salvation. I hope in your word. My eyes long for your promise. I ask, when will you comfort me? For I have become like a wineskin in the smoke, yet I have not forgotten your statutes. How long must your servant endure? When will you judge those who persecute me? The insolent have dug pitfalls for me. They do not live according to your law. All your commandments are sure. They persecute me with falsehood. Help me. They have almost made an end of me on earth, but I have not forsaken your precepts. In your steadfast love give me life, that I may keep the testimonies of your mouth. And that is where we will stop for today. And so now we're going to talk about where we are in Miracle on 34th Street. So Kris Kringle, he was being interviewed by the psychiatrist, I think he's a psychiatrist, I don't know. The guy that worked at Macy's, he decided he was fine, fit for duty, and he took over Macy's position in the store and made millions of dollars, bought all the toy section and distributed them around the country to every American child so that nobody had to purchase anything for Christmas ever again. And that is not how it went, but here's Kimberly to say how it really happened.
Wow, what a dream come true. people would save so much money over Christmas. So, what actually happened was he went over, they gave him a list of like, okay, if we don't have what they want, here's what you should tell them. Oh, hey, I can get this for you instead. He's like right when the guy walks away, he's like, I'm not gonna do that. And he rips the sheet into pieces and just throws it away. And he goes over and he says, this kid asked for like a fire engine that shoots water and everything. And he's like, oh, I think I've heard that they sell them over at this place. And he keeps telling everybody where the things that they want are.
Not the kids, the parents.
Yeah, the parents.
Can I say something?
I don't know what you want to say.
On his like registration card, to get the job, he actually wrote like the age for the age. It was as old as my lips, but older than my teeth. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
No, as old as my lips, but not as old.
As old as my tongue, I think is what it is.
No, not as old as my teeth, because baby teeth come out when you're like 1 or 2.
Yep. Okay. All right, keep going, Kimberly.
So sorry for the disruption. So all the parents are like, "Oh my gosh, this Santa Claus is so cool. He keeps telling us how to get the stuff our kids want." So they give a bunch of good reviews, and when the guy,
it's like all over the internet, on Google and all that.
Dad.
Oh.
And when the guy in charge figures out what his Santa Claus has been doing, he's like, "Oh my gosh, this guy has been telling all the parents to get stuff from all the competitors. This is a disaster." And then he walks through to try to fire him, and everybody's like, "Oh, thank you. Your Santa Claus has been so helpful. I've been able to find all this stuff, and I'm so glad." And he's like, they're really impressed with our work, so they'll buy from here more. So he goes over to, basically, Santa gets fired because, oh my gosh, he's crazy. He thinks he's actually Santa Claus. And then, the person who fired him gets told by the person in charge, "Hey, good job hiring that Santa." "Oh wait, you fired him? Okay, go hire him again or you're fired too."
I don't think they ever told Mr. Macy that they fired him.
Oh, yeah, they didn't tell him exactly, but she went over to work something out. So she rehired him, and he's like, "No, but I don't really like your attitude." And she convinces him, and he's like, "Okay, if I can get this person to believe I'm Santa Claus, then the world has hope." I'm going to hand it off to Dad, and sorry for my rambling summary. Here's Dad.
Okay. Hello, everybody. All right, we're on chapter 7. In spite of Dr. Pierce, Doris was just a little bit apprehensive about having Mr. Kringle in her home.
Oh, that's another thing.
Yeah, so she took Mr. Kringle home, and Mr. Shellhammer is going to talk to his wife about letting him stay after that. So just one night for this night. The dinner would be quite an ordeal, she was afraid, so she called Fred and invited him as a form of insurance. Fred accepted eagerly, especially when he learned who the guest of honor was to be. He even supplied the entree, a fine venison steak which a friend at the office had given him. Cleo had her own special way of preparing it. It looked very tempting indeed, but Mr. Kringle couldn't touch a mouthful. He was most apologetic. Venison steak being, of course, deer, and Santa couldn't eat deer, could he? Oh, dear. It's not that I'm a vegetarian, he explained. I love steak or pork or mutton, you know, but deer meat, well, I just couldn't. As a matter of fact, Chris turned out to be quite a gourmet, expounding on many kinds of choice dishes and how they should be cooked. Apparently, he had come by his vast tummy honestly through years of hearty eating. The dinner actually went off far better than Doris had expected. Fred and Doris helped Cleo with the dishes, and Mr. Kringle seized the opportunity to have a little talk with Susan. All through dinner he had been studying her solemn, wistful little face and hoping for just such a chance as this. Susan had been studying the old man, too. She was very puzzled by him. She knew her mother was right, of course. Mr. Kringle couldn't be Santa Claus because that was only another silly myth. And yet Mr. Kringle was different from anyone she had ever seen before. His talk with the little Dutch girl had made a deep impression, and when he had told her mother that he was Santa, it hadn't seemed silly to her at all. She knew it couldn't be true, but she secretly wished that it would be. "And what sort of games do you play with the other children?" Mr. Kringle wanted to know. Susan didn't play with them very much, she told him. The games they played were silly. "What sort of games?" Chris asked. "Well, today they were playing zoo," said Susan scornfully. "All of them were animals. They asked me what kind of animal I wanted to be. I didn't want to be an animal, so I didn't play." "Why didn't you tell them you were a lion or a bear?" "Because I'm not a lion. I'm a little girl," said Susan flatly. "But the other children weren't animals either. They were just pretending. That's what makes the game so silly." "I don't feel that way at all," said Chris. "It's really a lot of fun if you know how to play it. But of course you've got to use your imagination. Do you know what the imagination is, Susan?" The child nodded sagely. "That's when you see things that aren't really there." "Well, not exactly," said Chris with a smile. "No, to me the imagination is a place all by itself, a very wonderful country. You've heard of the British nation and the French nation." Susan nodded again. "Well, this is the imagination, and once you get there, you can do almost anything you want. How would you like to make snowballs in the summertime, or drive a big bus down Fifth Avenue? How would you like to have a ship of your own that makes daily trips to China and Australia?" Susan's face broke into a quiet little smile. Perhaps this was silly, but it was a lot of fun to think about. "How would you like to be the Statue of Liberty in the morning and fly south with a flock of geese in the afternoon?" Susan nodded eagerly in spite of herself. "Well, it's very simple, really," Chris said. "All it takes is a little practice. Wouldn't you like to try?" "Yes," said Susan softly. "I thought so," said Mr. Kringle, beaming. "Now then, let's start with something easy. How would you like to be a monkey in the zoo? That sounds like fun, eh?" We have a ding-dong. This ding-dong brought to you by Ding-dong. JJ, sit down. It's probably Amazon. All it takes is a little practice. Wouldn't you like to try? "Yes," said Susan. I already read that. How would you like to be a monkey in the zoo? That sounds like fun, eh?" "I'd like to," said Susan, "but I don't know how to be a monkey, Mr. Kringle." "Sure you do," said Chris with assurance. "Now just bend over a little, that's right, and curl your hands in." And so the first lesson began. Susan was a little slow and self-conscious at first, but in a few minutes she began to get the hang of it, and much to his delight, Chris found that he had a very apt and eager pupil. In the kitchen, Doris was wishing out loud that Mr. Shellhammer would call and take Mr. Kringle off her hands. She didn't like the idea of Chris's influence over Susan, even for one evening. Fred, on the other hand, was delighted. Chris, he felt, was just what the doctor ordered for a far too serious 6-year-old. "You ought to have him for dinner often," Fred suggested. "No, thank you," said Doris emphatically. "He's a sweet old man, but the less he's around Susan, the better I'll like it." With a hopeless shrug, Fred picked up a silver platter. "Where does this go?" he asked. "In the living room," said Doris, "on the second shelf." As Fred came into the room, the lesson was at its height. With amazing rapidity, Susan had evolved from a monkey into a fairy queen. With a royal touch of her magic wand, she was about to render Mr. Kringle, her faithful knight, invisible. Fred watched this performance with astonishment and delight. It was a crying shame, he thought, that Susan could not see more of Mr. Kringle, for in Chris he saw a perfect antidote for Doris's undeviating skepticism, and a little more contact with the old man might do wonders for Doris herself. If only there were some way. Then suddenly Fred had a brilliant idea. "Where are you staying, Mr. Kringle?" he asked. Chris explained that he was temporarily living with his friend Jim, the zookeeper. He felt, however, that he was imposing and he would have to find some other place. Fred jumped at the chance. He had an extra bed in his apartment, and he would be delighted to have Mr. Kringle stay with him. Chris was quick to accept. It would give him a chance to see more of Susan and her mother, and that was what he wanted more than anything. In the kitchen, Doris was talking to Mr. Shellhammer on the phone. He had encountered considerable difficulty with his wife, but he would keep his promise. He would take Mr. Kringle in. Doris put the receiver down for a moment and went into the living room. "What do you think?" she said to Chris, with an air of great surprise. "Mr. Shellhammer wants to know if you'd like to stay with him. He lives right near the store, and it would be so handy for you." But Mr. Kringle declined with thanks. He had already accepted Mr. Gailey's invitation. "Mr. Gailey?" asked Doris, dumbfounded. She turned and glanced at Fred. He was nodding and smiled innocently. So Fred had double-crossed her. With a grim "I see," she went back into the kitchen to tell Mr. Shellhammer that Mr. Kringle had made previous arrangements. And so Chris gathered his few simple belongings and moved in with Fred that night. Just as he was about to turn the light out, Fred looked over at Mr. Kringle, snugly settled in the other bed. "I'm very glad to have you, Mr. Kringle," he confessed, "because now I'll find out something I've always wanted to know. Does Santa sleep with his whiskers in or out of his blankets?" "Always sleep with them out," said Chris. "The cold air makes him grow." And I turned 2 pages. Now we will read chapter 8. To Doris, Mr. Kringle was still just a slightly touched old gentleman. But in the next few days she found that, sane or not, his influence was spreading amazingly and with astonishing results. Mr. Macy had carried out his plan to put Chris's policy into effect. Every employee throughout the great store cheerfully recommended other concerns and products to his customers. He had followed this up with a series of large advertisements in all the New York papers. Not only had Macy already gained many new accounts, but the idea was spreading to other stores. 1 block down from 34th Street, for example, Mr. Gimble threw the Macy ad angrily across his desk and turned to his assembled staff. "Why didn't one of you think of this?" he fumed. "Now Macy is suddenly the benevolent spirit, thinking only of the welfare of the public. And what does that make me? A profiteering money grubber. Well, 2 can play at this game. From now on, if we haven't got what the customer wants, send him over to Macy's." And so it started to grow. Other stores quickly followed suit. This new idea became the subject of editorials in the newspapers. Articles began to appear in the magazines. Radio comedians made quips about it. Almost overnight, it spread from coast to coast. Mr. Kringle, the center and symbol of the whole idea, was receiving an incredible amount of publicity. In spite of herself, Doris was impressed. She admitted as much as she and Chris went home together one evening. "Little did I dream," she told him, "when I saw you standing next to that float, that I was picking out the man who was going to revolutionize the entire merchandising business." "Neither did I," Chris admitted. "I'm very glad that I did it," said Doris. Mr. Kringle smiled happily. It was the first good sign, and he was quite encouraged. He seemed to be making progress in other directions, for on Sunday Chris went for a walk in the park, with his cane on one arm and Susan on the other. Inevitably, they wound up at the zoo. Chris stopped to feed the reindeer. As usual, they came running to him and ate out of his hand. Susan was very much impressed. It wasn't just the reindeer either. Being with Mr. Kringle was always an exciting adventure. He was full of all sorts of jokes and jingles and stories. Her mother would not approve, she felt sure, but it was a lot of fun. Now, as they walked along together, the old man broached the subject of her Christmas wish. It didn't seem right to him that a little girl like Susan had no wishes at all. She must want something. Every child did. Susan hesitated a long time before she answered. She had only one wish, and it was a big one. If he really was Santa Claus, she thought to herself, he could make it come true. And so she told Chris her one wish was for a house. A real house. Not a toy one. Not a toy one where she and her mother could live. Living in a New York apartment was not much fun for a girl her age. The house would have a real big yard with trees in it and a swing. Then she could just run out and play any time she wanted, instead of having to wait for Cleo or someone to take her to Central Park. Chris gulped. That's quite a tall order, he admitted, but I'll do my best. Well, said Susan with conviction, if you're really Santa, you can get it for me. And if you can't, then you're only a nice man with a white beard, like Mother says. Chris realized the challenge. Susan was a mighty shrewd little girl, and she had placed him squarely on the spot. From inside her little purse, she took the very worn and folded page of a magazine and handed it to him. It was a drawing, an architect's dream of a charming little colonial home. Susan explained the floor plan to Chris in great detail. Whew! What a tough order, thought the old man as he pocketed the drawing. He began to worry a little himself. Every child can't get every wish, Chris told her, but that doesn't mean there isn't a Santa Claus. Some children wish for things they couldn't use if they got them. Lots of little boys want real locomotives, for example. Why, they couldn't even get them into their houses. And little girls wish for baby brothers and sisters, even though their parents wouldn't be able to care for them properly. And besides, he continued, if every child got what he wanted right away, life wouldn't be half so much fun now, would it? Sometimes it's better to keep on wishing, so that when you get your wish, you really appreciate it. In other words, Chris concluded, there are lots of reasons why every wish a child makes can't come true. Susan could see that he was right in certain cases. But I've wished for this house a long time, Mr. Kringle, she told him, and I'll appreciate it if I get it. There was nothing more that Chris could say. It was up to him now, and he knew it. That night, as Fred and he were going to bed, Mr. Kringle began his campaign. He realized that there was only one way he could make Susan's wish come true. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Gailey might live in such a house, but Doris Walker could obviously never swing it alone, and so he casually questioned Fred about his relationship with Doris. Fred was very frank about it. He admitted being in love with Doris, but he also admitted that he could make no headway at all. He told Chris the story of her first marriage and what it had done to Doris. Now her whole life was organized about her daughter and her career, to the complete exclusion of any normal social activities. Doris saw to it that she had no private life at all. Chris nodded sadly. Doris is only one example, he said. That is what's happening to thousands and thousands of people in this world. I'm afraid you're right, said Fred. We've got to do something about it right away, said Chris with determination. You're right, we do, said Fred, but I wish I knew just what. Mr. Kringle was full of ideas. He persuaded Fred to take Doris out to dinner the following evening. Fred was only too eager to ask her, but she had steadfastly refused up to now. This time, Chris convinced him things would be different. He would see to it. The next morning, Chris gave Doris a great sales talk about her neighbor, Mr. Gailey. Doris seemed to agree with everything he said. He also quite casually mentioned the need for recreation, especially for someone who worked as hard as Doris. And again she agreed. So when Fred appeared in the toy department at closing time, Chris beamed at him happily as he left his dais. Fred had come to take Doris to dinner, hadn't he? Fred shook his head. Mrs. Walker was much too busy as usual. She was working the whole evening. Her dinner would be a sandwich and coffee at her desk, so Fred had stopped by for Chris. He thought they could go home together. "Oh, I see," said Mr. Kringle dryly. "She's too busy to see you, eh? Well, perhaps if I talk to her." "It's no use," Fred told him. "I've talked myself hoarse." "I see," Chris mused. "We'll have to think of something." There was a peculiar glint in Mr. Kringle's eyes as he retired to the locker room to change. It seemed to Fred that he took a long time about it, too. Finally, he got back to the locker room to find Chris, but the old man had gone. He had taken the service elevator down quite some time ago, the porter told him. What was Chris up to? Fred decided to return to Doris's office and use the phone. Cleo had not seen him, and nobody answered the phone in Fred's apartment. Doris called the Maplewood home, but he had not been there. By now, Doris had become quite alarmed. Chris had punched his time card and placed it in the rack as usual when he left the store. That had been nearly 3 hours ago. But if Chris had met with disaster, they could find no trace of it. They checked all the police stations, hospitals, and remembering Mr. Sawyer's dire predictions, Doris, with her heart in her mouth, even called the psychopathic ward at Bellevue. Chris was no place to be found. As the evening wore on and their search continued, Doris' anxiety grew, and it was not based entirely on Mr. Macy and her job. Fred was surprised to find that Doris had grown much fonder of Mr. Kringle than she herself realized. "I'm frankly amazed at you," he told her. "Why?" asked Doris. "Well, it's not like you at all," he told her. "The efficient, businesslike Mrs. Walker getting so upset about an eccentric old man." "Chris is not an eccentric old man, Fred," said Doris. "He's much more than... He's... Doris couldn't find the words. "I know just what you mean," said Fred, trying to conceal his elation, but all the efforts gained them nothing. They could find no trace of Mr. Kringle anywhere. Finally, heartsick and exhausted, Fred took Doris home. On the way, they stopped off at the Central Park Zoo, but Jim had not seen Chris since last Sunday when he had brought the little girl. That was their last straw. Now all they could do was wait and hope. And to add to Doris's unhappiness, she had lost a lovely little brooch, a treasured heirloom, and they had been so many places all through the store, the zoo, and in cabs, that she knew she'd never see it again. When Fred left Doris at the door to her apartment, she was on the verge of tears. His heart went out to her, but he knew her too well to say anything that might sound tender or comforting. The evening had brought them closer than they had ever been before, but any acknowledgment of this, he knew, would only frighten her right back into her shell again. So he simply said good night and turned to go. But Doris seemed reluctant to see him leave. She had never seen her looking... She... Turned 2 pages. She wanted to thank him for all he'd done. I don't know how I ever could have gone through the evening without you," she said. Fred smiled quietly. "You see, a man does come in handy every once in a while," he said. "I'm glad I could be helpful." "You were more than helpful, Fred," she said, and I'm more than grateful." He could see the tears welling up in her eyes now. She took a little step toward him and raised her head, and for a fleeting second Fred thought she was going to kiss him, but something quickly caught her and held her face frozen into a smile. "Good night," said Fred softly as he closed the door. He was still smiling warmly to himself as he entered his dark apartment. If it hadn't been for Chris, it would have been a wonderful evening. He was still puzzled by the old man's disappearance. At first he had felt sure it was some trick that Chris was playing, but as the evening wore on, a cold fear had begun to grip his heart. If anything had really happened to Mr. Kringle, the world would never be the same. As he snapped on the light in his bedroom, Fred suppressed a bellow, for there in his bed lay Mr. Kringle, peacefully asleep. Fred quickly snapped off the light again, but Chris was already sitting up eagerly and asking Fred what had happened. "We nearly went crazy, that's what happened," Fred told him. "You mean to say you've been here all this time?" Chris nodded with a chuckle. "Why didn't you answer the phone?" Fred asked. "We didn't know what happened to you. Doris and I have been chasing all over town." "Oh, you have, eh?" said Chris with a twinkle in his eye. Didn't you enjoy it? Didn't you two get together?" Well, yes, Fred was forced to admit they had. Chris grinned with satisfaction. "That's exactly what I hoped would happen. I'll have to try it again." "No, no!" Fred pleaded anxiously. "There must be easier ways." "You ought to be ashamed of yourself," Fred told him, trying his best to look angry. "Think of all the worry you caused Doris. I'm going over and tell her what a fiend you are before the poor girl spends a sleepless night." "Yes, do it, by all means," said Chris, beaming. "That'll give you a little more time together." Doris came to the door in a sheer, ruffled dressing gown, her hair streaming down her back. Fred had never seen her looking so feminine or appealing before. She seemed to be another person, a soft, alluring contrast to the severely tailored Mrs. Walker he had left a few minutes ago. Doris was so relieved by the news he brought her that she quite forgot her appearance as she let Fred in. But she couldn't understand it. Why had the old man done it? Where had he gone? Fred tried gingerly to explain. "It seems Mr. Kringle is playing Cupid as well as Santa Claus," he says. "He thinks we're two nice people and that we should spend more time together." "Oh," said Doris, but she didn't seem to mind the idea nearly as much as Fred thought she would. "That's why he did it. And I'll bet the old fox is peeping at us from his window right now," Fred concluded. "Well, in that case, you'd better stay and have a cup of coffee," said Doris. Chris could see into her living room from his bedroom, she pointed out. Fred very happily accepted the invitation. Fred enjoyed the next half hour more than any he could remember, for there was Doris next to him on the couch, and his arm was around her. Every time she moved away, Fred suddenly noticed that Chris was peeking at them. Of course, half the time Chris wasn't there. Finally, Fred could no longer use Mr. Kringle for an excuse, for it was obvious that the old man must have been asleep a long time. As he rose to leave, there came a terrified cry from Susan in her bed. The child was having a nightmare. Fred rushed into her room and caught Susan up in his arms. Doris followed, standing near the doorway. As Fred quietly comforted her, Susan slowly awoke from the dream, and as she saw Fred, a smile of happiness broke out on her tear-streaked face. "Oh, Uncle Fred, it's you," she said with great relief and reassurance. She had had an awful dream, but now that Uncle Fred was here, everything was all right. Doris was deeply moved by the little scene and strangely touched by her daughter's devotion to Uncle Fred. As Fred said good night to Doris, he took her tenderly in his arms and kissed her, and neither of them mentioned Mr. Kringle or the act they were supposed to be putting on. Chapter 9. Fred boldly entered the imposing portals of Tiffany & Company the following afternoon. He wanted to buy a brooch. He told the elderly, dignified clerk who condescended to wait on him, but he wanted a certain kind. He tried to describe the one Doris had lost, without much success. The clerk showed him several very handsome brooches, but none of them seemed to be what Fred was looking for. The clerk finally thought he knew what Fred had in mind. Unfortunately, he had nothing like that at the moment. "Why don't you try Cartier's?" he suggested. "It's only a few blocks away. They have some lovely things." Fred stared at the clerk in amazement. "Cartier's sent me here," he said. "Oh, yes," remarked the clerk. "Cartier's have sent us a number of customers lately." Fred left the store still lost in wonder. He had seen the advertisements and news stories heralding the wave of goodwill which Chris had started, but he realized now for the first time how widespread it had become. If Tiffany's were sending people to Cartier's, everything, or anything rather, could happen. Fred finally found a brooch he liked, and he entered Macy's in high spirits. To his surprise, everyone in the store seemed to reflect his mood. The doorman, a perennially harassed giant, beamed at him pleasantly. The elevator boys, whose grins wore grins as big as his, even the herd of customers who jammed the aisles, seemed to be in a new and jovial mood as they poked each other and trod on each other's shoes. Fred's astonishment grew with each new proof of Chris's magic. Mrs. Walker was not in her office, and Chris was not on his dais, but in one corner of the toy department a large crowd had gathered. Fred found Doris in the crowd watching what was going on in silent awe. For there, in a special setting in front of the Christmas tree, stood Mr. Macy and Mr. Gimble actually shaking hands. They were posing for photographers with Chris beaming behind them. "This," said Doris, "is the miracle of miracles, a sight I never thought I'd live to see." "And it's all because of Mr. Kringle," Fred mused. Doris nodded silently and smiled at Fred. Bulbs flashed as Macy and Gimble faced the battery of cameras, smiling cordially as each pumped the other's hand. Now we'll take one over at my store," said Mr. Gimble, and Mr. Macy eagerly agreed. Doris turned to Fred. "Pinch me, Fred," she said. "I simply don't believe it." Doris watched wide-eyed as the formalities proceeded. Now Mr. Macy was formally presenting Chris with a check, a bonus from the company, in appreciation of the wonderful new spirit which you have brought not only to Macy's, but to the entire city as well. Mr. Kringle accepted it happily. Mr. Macy jokingly asked him what he intended to do with all that money, but Chris knew exactly what he would do. "I'm going to make this particularly happy Christmas for someone who's been very kind to me," he said. "He's a doctor, and I'm going to give him an X-ray machine." "Well," Miss Macy replied, "that's going to be quite expensive." "Let me handle it," said Mr. Gimble eagerly. "We'll get it for you wholesale." "We'll get it at cost," said Mr. Macy. Fred turned to Doris and took a little package from his pocket. "I have a little presentation to make myself," he said as he handed it to her, "but I thought I'd omit any formal ceremonies." Doris was touched and delighted by the brooch. She even allowed Fred to pin it on her. As they walked back toward the office, Doris slipped her arm through his. Right in front of the entire toy department, she was walking with him, arm in arm. To Fred, this was even greater than the Macy Gimble miracle. "It seems to me you're catching the Kringle spirit too," he said. Doris looked up at him and smiled. "I'm afraid I am," she replied. That is where we will stop for today. We'll begin chapter 10 next time that I see you. And I have to say that I don't believe that the movie has quite this much in the romantic interaction between Doris and Fred. So we'll have to watch for that in the movie. Maybe it's there and I don't remember it. So we'll have to see when we watch it. All right, so that concludes our story for this evening. I hope that God is blessing you in everything that you're doing, and you have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.